At 11:30 a.m. on July 25, 1944, Captain Matt Urban limped down a dirt road outside Saint-Lô, France, watching his company pinned behind two burning Sherman tanks, taking casualties from German machine guns dug into the hedgerows 200 yards ahead. 24 years old, 6 months in Normandy, leg wound from a 37mm tank round 6 weeks earlier. The Germans had positioned 3 MG-42 machine guns in fortified positions, firing 1,200 rounds per minute, shredding any American who moved. Urban had checked himself out of a hospital in England 3 days earlier. The doctors told him his left leg needed another month. He walked with a makeshift cane, but he'd read in a newspaper that his company had suffered devastating losses in the hedgerow fighting. 70% casualties in 2 weeks. Most of his original platoon leaders were dead. The replacement officers lasted an average of 4 days. The 2nd Battalion, 60th Infantry Regiment, had jumped off at 1100 hours that morning in Operation Cobra, the breakout from Normandy. Urban arrived at the command post 30 minutes late. His company was already engaged, already bleeding. He found them stuck. 2 Shermans destroyed in the first 10 minutes, crews burned alive. A 3rd Sherman sat intact 50 yards forward, turret facing the German positions, engine running. But no tank commander, no gunner. The crew had been killed trying to reach it. Lieutenant Morrison had tried to mount the tank. A burst from an MG-42 cut him down 20 feet from the hull. Sergeant Davies tried next. He made it to the tank's side before a second burst dropped him. Both men died in the open ground between the American line and the Sherman. Urban watched this from a hedgerow. His leg throbbed. 6 weeks ago, a German tank had spotted him with a bazooka near Orgland. The 37mm round tore through his calf. Medics carried him out on a stretcher while he physically fought them, trying to stay with his men. The battalion surgeon finally sedated him and put him on a ship to England. He'd spent 4 weeks in a hospital bed reading reports. His battalion was getting slaughtered in the bocage. The hedgerows of Normandy were killing fields. Thick earthen walls topped with vegetation, creating a maze of small fields. Defenders could hide in the hedgerows and ambush attackers in the open. Sherman tanks couldn't see over the walls. German Panzerfaust teams waited in ambush. American infantry advanced into pre-sighted kill zones. The Germans called Urban something. He'd heard it from prisoners. Der Geist, the ghost. He'd been wounded 4 times before Normandy, Tunisia, Sicily, twice in France. Each time he came back. Each time the Germans thought they'd killed him. Each time he reappeared. Now his company was dying. Again. The Sherman sat there, 50 yards forward, engine idling, Browning 50 caliber machine gun loaded and ready. Nobody alive to fire it. The German positions were less than 200 yards away. A 50 cal could tear through the hedgerow, could suppress the MG-42 nest, could break the stalemate. But getting to the tank meant crossing 50 yards of open ground under fire from 3 machine guns. If you want to see whether Urban's decision to mount that tank saved his battalion, please hit that like button. It helps us share more stories like this. Subscribe if you haven't already. Back to Urban. Urban stared at the Sherman. His battalion commander, Major Wolfe, was watching from the command post through binoculars. Wolfe had promoted Urban to company commander in Tunisia after Urban killed a German soldier with a trench knife during a counterattack, then grabbed the dead man's machine pistol and stopped an entire German assault alone. Wolfe knew what Urban was thinking. So did every soldier in that hedgerow. Urban handed his cane to the man next to him, checked his pistol, and started walking toward the tank. His left leg barely worked. The wound hadn't healed. He couldn't run, could barely walk. But the tank was there. The gun was there. His men were dying. 50 yards of open ground. 3 German machine guns. 1,200 rounds per minute. Urban took his first step into the kill zone. The first burst came at 15 yards. The German gunner in the center hedgerow saw Urban immediately. A lone American officer, limping, moving toward the abandoned Sherman. Easy target. The MG-42 opened up. Tracers snapped past Urban's head. Dirt exploded at his feet. He kept walking. Couldn't run. The leg wouldn't let him. 20 yards. 30 yards. The other 2 machine guns joined in. 3 guns. 3,600 rounds per minute total. The air around Urban became a wall of lead. Bullets cracked past his ears, ricocheted off stones, tore through the grass. He didn't drop, didn't dive for cover, just kept moving forward, dragging his wounded leg, heading for the Sherman. The Americans in the hedgerow watched. Nobody breathed, nobody moved. They'd just seen 2 men die trying to reach that tank. Now their company commander, barely able to walk, was doing the same thing, in full view of 3 German machine guns. 40 yards. Urban's left leg buckled. The wound reopened. Blood soaked through his trousers. He caught himself, kept moving. The Sherman was right there. 20 feet. 15 feet. Bullets pinged off the tank's armor. One round hit the turret inches from where Urban would need to climb. 10 feet. He reached the hull, grabbed the front fender with both hands, pulled himself up. The tank was an M4 Sherman, 9 feet tall. The turret hatch was open. The 50 caliber Browning machine gun was mounted on top, exposed to enemy fire. To reach it, Urban had to climb onto the hull, then onto the turret, all while 3 machine guns concentrated fire on him. He got his good leg onto the track, pulled. His wounded leg screamed. Didn't matter. He hauled himself up onto the sloped front armor. Bullets hammered the metal around him. The sound was deafening. He kept climbing, got to the turret, grabbed the 50 cal's mount. One more pull, he was up, standing on top of the turret, completely exposed. The entire German position could see him now. Urban grabbed the Browning's charging handle, pulled it back. The gun was already loaded, 500 rounds in the ammunition box. He swung the barrel toward the center hedgerow, gripped the butterfly trigger, and opened fire. The 50 caliber Browning M2 fired at 550 rounds per minute. Each round was half an inch wide. Each round weighed 2 ounces. At 200 yards, a 50 cal could punch through brick walls, through sandbags, through the earthen hedgerows the Germans were hiding behind. Urban walked his fire into the center position. The tracers showed him exactly where the rounds were going. He adjusted, fired again. The heavy bullets tore through the hedgerow, shredded the vegetation, hammered into the German position behind it. The MG-42 in the center went silent. He shifted left, found the second gun position, fired. The 50 cal chewed through the hedgerow. The second MG-42 stopped firing. The tank's driver, still inside the hull, heard the 50 cal firing above him, heard an American officer shouting directions. The driver had been frozen, alone, his entire crew dead. Now someone was on his tank. Someone was fighting back. He put the Sherman in gear. The tank lurched forward. Urban nearly fell off, caught himself on the gun mount. The Sherman was moving now, rolling toward the German positions. Urban kept firing, raking the hedgerows. The third machine gun tried to shift fire to him. Urban found it first, poured 50 rounds into the position. The gun went silent. The Americans in the hedgerow saw their company commander standing on top of a moving tank, firing a 50 caliber machine gun at point-blank range into German positions, leg bleeding, refusing to take cover. One sergeant would later describe it as the craziest thing he'd ever seen in combat. But it was working. The German positions were being shredded. The MG-42s were silent. The hedgerow defenses were collapsing, and Urban was still firing. Still standing on that turret, still advancing. The men in the hedgerow didn't need orders. They saw what Urban was doing. They stood up, fixed bayonets, and charged. The entire 2nd Battalion rose from cover and attacked. 600 men, following one captain on top of a tank. The breakout from Normandy had begun, but Urban's 50 cal went silent. He'd burned through all 500 rounds. The German positions were 200 yards behind him now. The Sherman had rolled past them. Urban was alone, deep in German-held territory, and a Panzerfaust team was moving up from the right flank. The Panzerfaust team was 30 yards away when Urban spotted them. 2 German soldiers, moving through a gap in the hedgerow. One carried the launcher. The other carried a spare warhead. The Panzerfaust could penetrate 4 inches of armor at 150 yards. At 30 yards, it would punch straight through the Sherman. Urban had no ammunition. The 50 cal was empty. His pistol was holstered. The tank driver couldn't see the Germans from inside the hull. Urban pounded on the turret, shouted directions. The driver couldn't hear him over the engine noise. The German with the Panzerfaust raised the launcher, aimed at the Sherman's side armor. Urban had 3 seconds, maybe 4. He dropped off the turret, hit the ground hard. His wounded leg gave out completely. He rolled, drew his pistol, came up firing. The range was too far for a pistol, 30 yards, but the movement was enough. The German gunner flinched, ducked. The Panzerfaust round went high, missed the Sherman by 5 feet. The tank kept rolling, smashed through the hedgerow. The German soldiers scattered. Urban limped back toward American lines. His company was already 200 yards past the original German positions. The breakthrough was complete. Major Wolfe watched from the command post. He turned to Staff Sergeant Earl Evans, his clerk, told him to write up a Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Urban, immediately. Evans pulled out his notebook and started writing. Wolfe dictated the details: the tank, the 50 cal, the charge. The 2nd Battalion advanced 4 miles that day. Operation Cobra was working. The American breakout from Normandy had begun. Patton's Third Army would exploit the gap. The Germans were retreating. The hedgerow stalemate was broken. Urban refused medical evacuation. His leg wound had reopened completely. The battalion surgeon found him at 1600 hours, still with his company, still directing movement. The surgeon ordered him to the aid station. Urban refused, said his men needed him. The surgeon threatened to have him carried out. Urban said he'd shoot anyone who tried. The battalion advanced again the next day, and the day after that. Urban stayed with them, leg wound untreated, barely walking, but leading. August 2nd, 1944, 8 days after the tank incident. The 2nd Battalion was attacking German positions near Tessy-sur-Vire. Urban was moving with his lead platoon when German artillery found them. 88mm guns, high-velocity shells. The first round hit 20 yards to Urban's left. The second hit 10 yards to his right. The third round airburst directly overhead. Shrapnel tore through Urban's chest. Multiple fragments. One piece missed his heart by less than 2 inches. He went down. The platoon sergeant reached him first. Urban was bleeding from the chest. Breathing was difficult. The sergeant called for a medic. The medic arrived within 60 seconds, examined the wound, told Urban he needed immediate evacuation. Chest wound, possible lung damage, possible internal bleeding. Urban refused. The medic said he could die. Urban said he'd die with his company. The battalion surgeon arrived 20 minutes later, found Urban sitting against a hedgerow, holding a compress to his chest wound, directing his platoon's advance by hand signals. The surgeon examined him. 3 shrapnel fragments in the chest. 1 fragment lodged near the heart. 1 fragment had penetrated the lung. Urban was coughing blood. The surgeon gave Urban a direct order: evacuation, immediate, hospital, surgery. Urban refused the order. The surgeon said he could have Urban arrested. Urban said the Germans would probably kill him first, so the arrest wouldn't matter. They compromised. The surgeon bandaged the chest wound in the field, gave Urban morphine, left him with his company, but told him that if he collapsed, the medics would evacuate him whether he wanted it or not. Urban stayed. Led his company through 3 more days of fighting, the shrapnel fragments still in his chest, the lung wound untreated. Moving through pain that would have hospitalized most men. August 6, 1944, 4 days after the chest wound. The 2nd Battalion was attacking near Cherbourg when Major Wolfe was killed by German artillery fire. Direct hit on his command post. Wolfe died instantly. Staff Sergeant Evans was wounded in the same strike. The battalion executive officer was also killed. The division commander needed a new battalion commander, immediately. The 2nd Battalion was in the middle of an attack. Someone had to take command. Someone who knew the unit. Someone the men would follow. The division commander chose Urban, 24 years old, company commander for 3 months, wounded 6 times, shrapnel still in his chest, could barely walk, could barely breathe. Urban took command of the 2nd Battalion at 1800 hours on August 6th, 800 men. His promotion to major would come later. Right now, he had a battalion in combat and orders to advance into Belgium. But the shrapnel in his chest was moving. The lung wound was getting worse, and he just received intelligence that a full German panzer division was repositioning directly in his path. The Panzerfaust team was 30 yards away when Urban spotted them. 2 German soldiers moving through a gap in the hedgerow. One carried the launcher. The other carried a spare warhead. At 30 yards, a Panzerfaust could punch straight through the Sherman's side armor. Urban had no ammunition. The 50 cal was empty. His pistol was holstered. The tank driver couldn't see the Germans from inside the hull. Urban pounded on the turret, shouted directions. The driver couldn't hear over the engine. The German raised the launcher. Aimed. Urban had 3 seconds. He dropped off the turret, hit the ground hard. His wounded leg gave out. He rolled, drew his pistol, came up firing. The range was too far for accurate pistol fire, but the movement was enough. The German flinched. The Panzerfaust round went high. Missed. The Sherman kept rolling. Smashed through the hedgerow. Urban limped back toward American lines. His company was already 200 yards past the original German positions. The breakthrough was complete. Major Wolfe watched from the command post, turned to Staff Sergeant Earl Evans, told him to write up a Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Urban, immediately. Evans pulled out his notebook. Wolfe dictated the details. The tank, the 50 cal, the charge that broke the stalemate. The 2nd Battalion advanced 4 miles that day. Operation Cobra was working. The breakout from Normandy had begun. The hedgerow stalemate was broken. Urban refused medical evacuation. His leg wound had reopened completely. The battalion surgeon found him at 1600 hours, still with his company. The surgeon ordered him to the aid station. Urban refused, said his men needed him. August 2nd, 1944, 8 days after the tank incident. The 2nd Battalion was attacking near Tessy-sur-Vire. Urban was moving with his lead platoon when German artillery found them. 88mm guns. The 3rd round air burst overhead. Shrapnel tore through Urban's chest. Multiple fragments. One piece missed his heart by less than 2 inches. He went down. The platoon sergeant reached him first. Urban was bleeding from the chest. Breathing was difficult. The medic examined the wound, told Urban he needed immediate evacuation. Chest wound. Possible lung damage. Urban refused. The medic said he could die. Urban said he'd die with his company. The battalion surgeon arrived 20 minutes later, found Urban sitting against a hedgerow, holding a compress to his chest, directing his platoon by hand signals. 3 shrapnel fragments in the chest, 1 near the heart, 1 had penetrated the lung. Urban was coughing blood. The surgeon gave a direct order. Evacuation. Immediate. Urban refused. They compromised. The surgeon bandaged the wound in the field, gave Urban morphine, told him if he collapsed, the medics would evacuate him regardless. Urban stayed, led his company through 3 more days of fighting, the shrapnel still in his chest, the lung wound untreated. August 6th, Major Wolfe was killed by German artillery, direct hit on his command post. Staff Sergeant Evans was wounded in the same strike. The battalion executive officer was also killed. The division commander needed a new battalion commander immediately. The 2nd Battalion was in the middle of an attack. He chose Urban, 24 years old, company commander for 3 months, wounded 6 times, shrapnel in his chest, could barely walk. Urban took command at 1800 hours on August 6th, 800 men. His promotion to major would come later. Right now, he had a battalion in combat and orders to advance into Belgium. September 1st, 1944. The 2nd Battalion received orders to cross the Meuse River near here, Belgium. Intelligence reported heavy German concentrations. The crossing would be opposed. The Americans needed to establish a bridgehead quickly. Urban studied the terrain. The Meuse was 200 feet wide. The Germans held the far bank. Machine gun nests overlooking the river. Mortar teams. Artillery observers. September 3rd, 0500 hours. The American artillery barrage began. 20 minutes of fire, then smoke shells. The infantry moved at 0520. Assault boats hit the water. The Germans opened fire immediately. Machine guns, mortars, artillery. The first wave took heavy casualties, 15% in 5 minutes. The second wave hesitated. The boats were being hit. Men were dying in the water. The assault was stalling. Urban was at the battalion command post 300 yards from the river. The radio reports were bad. The assault was failing. His men were dying at that crossing. Urban left the command post, started walking toward the river. The battalion surgeon tried to stop him. Urban pushed past. His chest wound was bleeding through the bandages. His leg barely worked, but his men were dying. He reached the riverbank at 0540, found the second wave. 200 men crouched behind cover, afraid to move. Urban didn't give orders, just started walking toward the boats, limping, bleeding, heading into the kill zone. The men saw their battalion commander walking into machine gun fire. Again, they followed. Urban climbed into a boat. The oarsman pushed off. Machine gun fire tore through the smoke. Rounds snapped past his head. Halfway across, a German gunner found the range, adjusted fire. The rounds hit Urban in the throat. The bullet entered below Urban's jaw on the left side, exited through the right side of his neck, tore through his larynx, severed blood vessels. Urban's hand went to his throat. Blood poured between his fingers. He tried to speak. Nothing came out. No sound, just blood. The oarsman kept rowing, got the boat to the far bank, pulled Urban out, dragged him onto Belgian soil. Urban was conscious, alert, but couldn't breathe properly, couldn't speak. Blood was filling his throat. He was drowning in his own blood. A medic reached him within 30 seconds, saw the throat wound, saw the amount of blood, called for the battalion surgeon. The surgeon was still on the American side of the river. The medic did what he could, applied pressure, tried to stop the bleeding. Couldn't. The wound was too severe. Urban was choking. The medic rolled him onto his side, let the blood drain. Urban coughed. Blood sprayed from the wound, but he could breathe again. Barely. Each breath was agony. Each breath brought more blood. The second wave had made it across. 200 men on the Belgian side. The Germans were still firing, machine guns raking the shoreline, mortars dropping on the beachhead. The Americans were pinned, couldn't advance, couldn't establish the bridgehead. Urban tried to stand, fell, tried again. The medic pushed him down, told him to stay still. Urban shook his head, pointed toward the German positions, pointed at his men. They were pinned. They needed leadership. He couldn't speak, couldn't give orders, couldn't coordinate the attack, but he could point, could gesture, could lead by example. Urban got to his feet. The medic tried to stop him. Urban pushed past, started walking inland, away from the river, toward the German positions. Blood running down his chest, throat wound gushing. He couldn't speak above a whisper, couldn't even whisper, just a rasp, a hiss of air through damaged tissue. The men saw him, saw their battalion commander, shot in the throat, walking toward the Germans, still leading, still fighting. They followed. Again. The Americans pushed inland, 50 yards, 100 yards. The German machine guns fell silent. The mortars stopped. The defenders were withdrawing. The beachhead was secure. Urban collapsed at 06:15. The battalion surgeon had crossed in the third wave, found Urban unconscious on the ground 200 yards from the river. Throat wound still bleeding, chest wound from August reopened, leg wound from July infected. The surgeon examined him quickly. Urban had no pulse, no breathing. The surgeon thought he was dead. Then Urban coughed. Blood. But he was breathing. Barely. The surgeon called for a stretcher, got Urban onto it, started working. The throat wound was catastrophic. The larynx was destroyed. Major blood vessels were severed. The surgeon had no surgical equipment, no operating room, just field supplies in a combat zone. He did what he could. Stopped the bleeding, stabilized the airway, got Urban breathing through the damaged throat, then ordered immediate evacuation. Field hospital, emergency surgery. Urban would die without it. The stretcher bearers carried Urban back to the riverbank, got him across, loaded him into an ambulance. The ambulance drove to a field hospital 12 miles away. Urban arrived at 07:30. The surgeons examined him, told the ambulance driver to prepare for a body. Urban wouldn't survive the next hour. They performed emergency surgery anyway, tried to repair the larynx. Couldn't. The damage was too severe. They stopped the internal bleeding, closed the wound, left Urban with a damaged voice box and a 50% chance of survival. Urban was unconscious for 18 hours, woke up on September 4th, tried to speak. Nothing came out. Just a whisper, a rasp. His voice was gone. The surgeons told him the larynx was permanently damaged. He would never speak normally again. They also told him he was being evacuated to England, then to the United States. Medical discharge, 20 months in combat, 7 wounds, 7 Purple Hearts. His war was over. Urban tried to argue. Couldn't. No voice. He wrote a note, asked about his battalion. The surgeon said the battalion was advancing into Germany, without him. Urban was going home. The medical staff prepared him for transport. September 5th, an ambulance took him to an airfield. A C-47 transport plane waited. Other wounded men were already aboard. The plane would fly to England. Then Urban would ship to the United States, to a hospital, to recovery, to civilian life. But Staff Sergeant Earl Evans wasn't on that plane. Evans had been wounded on August 6, captured by the Germans during the fighting after Major Wolf's death. He was in a prisoner of war camp in Germany. He'd spent the last month thinking Urban was dead. Saw him bleeding from the throat wound that last day. Left for dead on a Belgian riverbank. Evans didn't know Urban had survived. Didn't know Urban was being evacuated. Didn't know the Medal of Honor recommendation he'd written in July was sitting in a destroyed command post in France. Major Wolf was dead. The paperwork was lost. Nobody else knew about the recommendation. Matt Urban was going home. Wounded 7 times, Medal of Honor recommended. But the recommendation was buried in French mud, and it would stay buried for 34 years. Urban arrived in England on September 7, 1944. Spent 3 days in a military hospital outside London. The doctors examined his throat wound, confirmed the larynx was permanently damaged, told him he'd never speak louder than a whisper, maybe never speak at all, depended on how the tissue healed. September 10th, Urban boarded a hospital ship bound for the United States. The voyage took 11 days. He couldn't talk to the other wounded men, couldn't tell his story, couldn't explain what had happened at the Meuse River crossing. Just sat on deck, silent, watching the Atlantic. The ship docked in New York on September 21st. Urban was transferred to an army hospital in upstate New York. Spent 2 months there. Physical therapy for his leg, treatment for his chest wounds. The shrapnel fragments were still embedded near his heart, too dangerous to remove. They'd stay there for the rest of his life. The doctors worked on his voice, speech therapy, exercises to strengthen the damaged vocal cords. Nothing worked. Urban could whisper, could make a raspy sound, but normal speech was impossible. The bullet had destroyed too much tissue. November 1944. Urban was transferred to a veterans hospital in Michigan, closer to home. Buffalo, New York was only a few hours away. His family visited. His mother saw the throat scar, cried, asked what happened. Urban couldn't tell her. No voice. He started writing things down, carried a small notebook, wrote responses to questions. It was slow, frustrating, but it was communication. The Army promoted Urban to Major in October 1944 while he was in the hospital. Promoted him to Lieutenant Colonel in October 1945. Both promotions were based on his combat record. 800 men commanded in combat, multiple successful operations, but nobody mentioned a Medal of Honor. The recommendation was gone, lost somewhere in France. Major Wolf was dead. The command post where he dictated the citation to Evans had been destroyed by artillery. The paperwork was buried in rubble, or burned, or simply misplaced in the chaos of war. February 26, 1946. Urban was medically retired from the United States Army. Rank of Lieutenant Colonel. 20 months in combat, 7 wounds, 14 decorations, including 2 Silver Stars, Legion of Merit, 3 Bronze Stars, and 7 Purple Hearts, but no Medal of Honor. He returned to civilian life, found work in Port Huron, Michigan, recreation director, organizing sports programs, working with kids. It was quiet work, peaceful work. Nobody asked about the war. Nobody knew who Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban was. He preferred it that way. July 1945. Staff Sergeant Earl Evans was liberated from a German prisoner of war camp. He'd been captured on August 6, 1944. Same day Major Wolf was killed. Evans had spent 11 months in German captivity, survived, came home. Evans remembered Major Wolf's order, the Medal of Honor recommendation for Captain Urban, the tank at St. Lo. Evans had been writing it up when the artillery hit. Never finished it, never submitted it. But he remembered. Evans wrote a letter to the War Department, July 5, 1945. Detailed Urban's actions at St. Lo, the wounded leg, the abandoned tank, the .50 caliber machine gun, the charge that broke the German positions. Evans explained that Major Wolf had ordered the Medal of Honor recommendation before he was killed. Explained that the paperwork was lost in combat. The letter was forwarded to Major General Jesse Ladd, commander of the 9th Infantry Division. Ladd's office was in Germany. The division was on occupation duty. The letter arrived, was acknowledged, then disappeared. Nobody told Urban about Evans' letter. Nobody contacted him. The War Department never followed up. The recommendation vanished into administrative files. Urban lived quietly in Port Huron for 7 years, got married, started a family, never talked about the war. When people asked about his raspy voice, he said it was a war injury, didn't elaborate. When veterans asked if he'd served, he said yes, didn't mention his rank, didn't mention his decorations, just said he'd been in the infantry. 1956. Urban moved to Monroe, Michigan, took a job running the community center. 16 years in that position, organized youth sports leagues, ran summer camps, coached boxing. Nobody in Monroe knew he'd commanded a battalion in combat. Nobody knew about the 7 wounds. Nobody knew the Germans had called him the Ghost. 1972. Urban moved to Holland, Michigan, became the city's recreation director. His daughter Jennifer was in high school. His wife Jenny was active in the Red Cross. Urban was 63 years old. His voice was still a rasp. The shrapnel was still in his chest. His legs still hurt in cold weather. But he was alive. He'd survived. The war was 30 years in the past. Most of the men he'd served with were dead or scattered. The 9th Infantry Division held occasional reunions. Urban didn't attend, didn't want to relive it, didn't want to remember the hedgerows, the river crossings, the friends who hadn't come home. In a filing cabinet at Army headquarters in Washington, a copy of Staff Sergeant Evans' letter sat in Matt Urban's personnel file, unread, forgotten, buried under decades of paperwork, until 1977. July 1977. The 9th Infantry Division held a reunion in Washington. Veterans from across the country attended. Men who'd fought in North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, Belgium, Germany. Most were in their 50s now, some in their 60s. All carried memories of combat. Earl Evans attended. He'd stayed in touch with several men from the 2nd Battalion, occasionally asked about Urban. Nobody had seen him. Nobody knew where he was. Evans assumed Urban had died from his wounds. The throat wound in Belgium looked fatal. Evans had last seen Urban bleeding on a riverbank, left for dead. Then someone mentioned Holland, Michigan, said a recreation director there was a former lieutenant colonel, infantry, 9th Division, had a distinctive raspy voice, war injury. Evans made calls, found Matt Urban, called him in Holland. Urban answered. Evans recognized the whisper immediately. Urban was alive. 33 years after Belgium, still alive. They talked for an hour. Evans asked about the Medal of Honor. Urban didn't know what he meant. Evans explained. Major Wolfe's order. The recommendation Evans had written. The letter he'd sent in 1945. Urban said he'd never heard about it, never received any Medal of Honor, just his silver stars and Purple Hearts and the other decorations. Evans was stunned. He'd written that letter 32 years ago, sent it to the War Department, assumed it had been processed, assumed Urban had received the medal decades ago. He started making calls, contacted the disabled American veterans, contacted the Polish-American Congress in Washington, told them about Urban's combat record, about the tank at St. Lo, about the throat wound at the Meuse River, about the lost recommendation. The organization started pushing. February 1979. Chief Warrant Officer Carl Hansen at the Army's Awards Office received an inquiry, a request for information about a Medal of Honor recommendation for Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban. Hansen searched the files. He found Evans' letter from July 1945, found a copy in Urban's personnel file, read it, verified the details against unit records. Everything checked out. The 2nd Battalion had attacked at St. Lo on July 25th. Urban had mounted the tank. The battalion had broken through. Major Wolfe had been killed on August 6th. Hansen kept digging, found more documentation, found witness statements from soldiers who'd served with Urban, found after-action reports describing the tank incident, found medical records showing Urban's 7 wounds, found everything except the original Medal of Honor recommendation that Wolfe had dictated to Evans. But the copy of Evans' letter was enough. Hansen forwarded the case to higher authority. The Army reviewed Urban's entire combat record, June 1944 to September 1944. The bazooka attacks, the tank, the chest wound, the battalion command, the Meuse River crossing, the throat wound. The Army concluded that Urban's actions met the criteria for the Medal of Honor. met them multiple times over. The recommendation should have been processed in 1945. The paperwork had been lost. The error needed to be corrected. July 10, 1980. Urban received a phone call at his office in Holland, the White House. The caller told him he was being awarded the Medal of Honor. President Jimmy Carter would present it personally. July 19th, Washington. Urban couldn't speak, not because of the damaged larynx, because he was crying. July 19th, 1980. The Shoreham Americana Hotel in Washington. 500 people in attendance. Veterans of the 9th Infantry Division. Urban's wife, Jenny, his daughter, Jennifer, Earl Evans. President Carter entered at 1000 hours, looked at Urban standing in dress uniform, saw a 60-year-old man who could barely speak above a whisper, who had shrapnel embedded near his heart, who walked with a slight limp, who had waited 36 years for this moment. Carter read from the citation, described the actions at Renouf, at St. Lo, at the Meuse River, called Urban's service a sustained campaign of sacrifice across nearly 3 months of continuous combat. Then Carter said something not in the official citation, called Matt Urban the greatest soldier in American history. Carter placed the pale blue ribbon around Urban's neck. The Medal of Honor hung on Urban's chest. Urban tried to speak, thank the president, thank his men. Nothing came out except a whisper. Evans stepped forward from the crowd. The two men embraced, kissed each other on the cheek. Brothers. 36 years after Belgium, the audience stood, cheered. 500 veterans honoring one of their own. Matt Urban stood silent, unable to speak, tears running down his face, holding the medal he should have received in 1945. The paperwork had been lost for 34 years, but the ghost had finally come home. Urban returned to Holland, Michigan on July 20th, 1980. The Medal of Honor ceremony had lasted 3 hours. Hundreds of veterans, national television coverage, the President of the United States calling him the greatest soldier in American history. But Urban went back to work the next Monday. City Recreation Director. Same job he'd held for 8 years. Same office, same desk. He didn't talk about the medal, didn't display it prominently, kept it in a drawer. When people asked to see it, he'd show them, but he never brought it up himself. He spent the next 9 years speaking to veterans groups across the country, American Legion posts, VFW halls, high schools, talking about service, about sacrifice, about the men who didn't come home. His voice was still a rasp, still damaged from the throat wound in Belgium, but he could be heard in a quiet room. Urban never called himself a hero. When reporters asked about his combat record, he redirected to his men, the soldiers who followed him, the ones who charged when he mounted that tank, the ones who crossed the Meuse River, the ones buried in France and Belgium. He wrote an autobiography, The Matt Urban Story, Life and World War II Experiences, published in 1989, detailed his 20 months in combat, the 7 wounds, the battles. But the book wasn't about glory. It was about survival, about brotherhood, about men who did their duty and expected nothing in return. Urban retired from the Holland Recreation Department in 1989, stayed active with the Red Cross, directed camps for underprivileged children, coached youth sports, served as a Cub Scout leader and Boys Club director. The same work he'd done for 40 years, helping kids, building community, living quietly. The shrapnel fragments stayed in his chest, too close to the heart to remove safely. They'd been there since August 1944, 46 years. The doctor said they'd probably stay there until he died. March 3rd, 1995. Urban was working in his office in Holland, 75 years old, retired but still active, still involved in youth programs. He collapsed at his desk. An ambulance took him to Holland Community Hospital. The doctors examined him. His left lung had collapsed. The old wounds, the shrapnel, the damage from 1944 had finally caught up. His lung couldn't function properly anymore. Urban died on March 4th, 1995, 75 years old, 50 years after the war ended. The cause of death was complications from a collapsed lung, the lung that had been damaged by German shrapnel in August 1944. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Section 7, Full Military Honors. His headstone reads, Lieutenant Colonel Matt Urban, Medal of Honor, World War II, the most decorated soldier in American history, lies among thousands of other veterans. No special monument, no elaborate memorial, just a white headstone like everyone else. His Medal of Honor citation is displayed at the Pentagon. His story is taught at the United States Military Academy at West Point. The 2nd Battalion headquarters building at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, was named Urban Hall in 2017. But for 40 years, nobody knew his name. The paperwork was lost, the recommendation buried, the ghost forgotten, until Earl Evans refused to let it stay buried. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor, hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about officers who mounted tanks under fire, about soldiers who fought through 7 wounds. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States? United Kingdom? Canada? Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure Matt Urban doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.